Travel and Things in association with Sun Destinations, iconic destinations with amazing experiences, present In Conversation With. I am your host, David Batsoffen, and my guest today is the author of this book, which recently crossed my desk, Bait, to Catch a Killer. It's published by Melinda Ferguson and written by Janine Lazarus, who some people may remember as being a journalist in The Star back in the early 1990s. Janine, good morning. Welcome to you.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for hosting me on the show.
It's only a pleasure. Why Bait now?
Well, because I wrote it during lockdown. I had to find something to do during lockdown. And also because, exactly, and also because the Norwood Killer, after 27 years of incarceration, was applying for his fourth parole.
Right.
And he has always been ever present in my life, from the time that he was raping and killing and carving a swathe of terror in my neighborhood, to leaving newspapers and being asked 12 years after his arrest to write a piece for The Star. The headline was, "God help us if he gets parole," to working with Clive Morris Productions on a program that Malcolm Gooding was, he was the anchor.
Right.
It was called Criminal Minds on Mnet. And we filmed the rape and murder scene in my bedroom in Norwood. So
Wow.
that was like my third, if you like, encounter with the Norwood Killer. It was very real, because when the crew left, my sheets were full of red, it was supposed to be blood, but it was makeup. And the next morning when I went to Bath, what the Norwood Killer did is he raped a victim, he frog marched her to the bath, he made her climb into the bath, he smoked a cigarette, he put it out on the tiles, and then he shot her in the head. And I remember that morning brushing my teeth and looking up at the tiles and seeing a burn mark there. So that was the third sort of encounter, having my bedroom and my bathroom used for the shoot. And then this was the fourth time. He's applied for 4 paroles, and I thought it's time to close the book on him and to see whether he remembers me.
So before we go into the story and the background and your background,
right.
Was that parole attempt successful, or is he still incarcerated?
No, it wasn't. I mean, he's been applying for parole ever since he's been in jail, but he's been in jail for half his life. He's 6 months younger than I am.
Right.
So he's probably around 59 now. And he keeps applying for parole. I mean, who knows when he's going to get it or not? Because lots of people after serving 25 years, even for, he was sentenced 5 times to death, but it was commuted to life. So I don't think it's unlikely that he'll receive parole.
Now, the book, as we mentioned, is called Bait, to Catch a Killer, published by Melinda Ferguson Books. She tends to publish books that are a little off-center and maybe won't hit sort of mainstream top 10, but it gives people like yourself an opportunity to maybe rid yourself of this cloak that has been with you for a long time. Because, and I'm going to ask you to go into some depth on this, you went to visit him as if playing bait was not enough. You went to visit him in prison on more than one occasion, and he was not very complimentary to you or what you were trying to
do. No. I'm an ex-news hack, so there was nothing I didn't do as a journalist. And the book, I think, is more than just a personal memoir. It throws into light the sort of ethical battle, if you like, between a journalist who is essentially stepping into the realm of getting involved in a story. And I should never, ever have done that. So that's the first thing. Second of all is an editor who put me in the line of fire, because my flat at that particular point was used as a surveillance point for the police to try and get him. And then, of course, it throws into light the fact that the police used me as a decoy to try and catch him. So So there's that dynamic, the whole ethical question. There's also covering crime where Black people were still reported on like some homogenous mass. They never had names, they never had identities. Police didn't care whether his victims were raped or not raped. And it's also during the heyday of the Bang Bang Club, and it's set around the Bishu massacre and Madiba and de Klerk getting the UN Peace Prize, and Paul Simon being the first sanctions busting superstar to come into this country.
Right.
So 27 years later, during lockdown, I got a bee in my bonnet, and I typed up a synopsis for Melinda, and I knew she'd take it because I know the kinds of books and of books that her kinds of authors and the books that she publishes. And Melinda took one look at my synopsis and she said, it's a great feature article, but how are you going to write this into a book?
After all that,
yeah,
put
and
your life on the line, and they tell you your life story is basically a feature article.
Exactly, but she was right, because I'm a hard news reporter and I've never written long form journalism or long form writing, and it was really a hassle. I mean, I squeezed out 60,000 words. It was I tried to hit the 120 mark. I didn't have it in me. I mean, I could have waxed lyrical on things, but I was quite brutal in cutting and editing. Going to see him was spectacularly emotionally upsetting experience in the beginning, and by the third visit I'd so had enough of him that I couldn't wait to wash the stench of my experience and of being inside the prison off me. The first time I went, we were the second group of visitors who were allowed into prison because the lockdown had just lifted. So he was clearly very hungry to see somebody, but he didn't know it was me. And I never went through the official channels because I know, having worked as a reporter for almost 40 years, you're going to try and get through correctional services. It's like trying to talk to a wall. You're never going to get there. So I asked my assistant to find his prison number, which was no mean feat, but I've trained her well. We managed to find where he was, which, I mean, there's a plethora of jails in this country. He was in Boksburg. He was at Boksburg prison to try and find his prison number and his ID. And for some, we went through court records. It took a hell of a lot of research. And she presented it to me. And I called the prison and I said I wanted to meet with him. And they said, who are you? And I said, a friend. And I arrived on a winter's morning. I woke up with a mixture of emotions because when he terrorized me and my neighborhood, he really terrorized me. A woman left the suburb en masse. You would see women driving around in vehicles, 5 in a car, because they were too scared to go home. A lot of them moved out of their flats into their boyfriends' homes or came home to kind of feed the cat and water the plants. The whole of Norwood became a ghost town. I mean, if you drive down Grant Avenue and Iris Road, you will still see the burglar bars and the razor wire on the first 4 flats. So this was sort of playing in my mind. And I was really nervous. And my husband came with me and we drove into this very foreboding correctional services place. And we all queued outside it was almost like a COVID station. Everybody was wearing their masks and we were all standing 1.5 meters, away from each other. And we got to like a booth and there were 2 correctional services officers, men, and they opened up this book and they found my name and they found his name. It was really weird to see Janine Lazarus Quivers Geldenes. And they said, right, your appointment is at 9. We were then bundled off. We were given a little ticket and we were bundled off into this, I can only describe it as a dirty cement block with peeling paint and pictures on the wall of wanted people, mainly Black. And the one picture that upset me probably more than any of the others was a baby. I don't know if it was a she or he, but she was dressed in nappies, the baby. And the baby's hands were up against the wall with a correctional service officer patting her down for drugs because that's the way drugs are smuggled into prison, in babies' nappies.
Okay.
And I found it so difficult. And
Mm.
you know, we were all sitting there, and all of these people around me are all people coming to visit their loved ones in prison. And you would see people carrying transparent packaging, it's got to be transparent, with soap and washcloths and sweets and, you know, all of these transparent packages. So, you know, you're once a journalist, always a journalist. So I sat talking to the man
Of
next
course
to
you
me,
did.
and he probably was in his 80s, and he said, no, his son had been really stupid. His son was the black sheep of the family. He'd actually got drunk. He went to a pub, he got drunk, and he shot and killed a friend of his. And this gentleman had to literally, you know, and he fled the scene. So I got into contact, and, you know, he said, why are you here? And I said, well, I'm here to see a friend. He said, what has your friend done? And I said, well, he's killed 5 people, and even he seemed to be shocked. But I watched people, and they all seemed incredibly tired. Well, you know,
I should
can imagine.
Yeah, I should imagine
You know,
that sort of emotional, the level of emotions that when you're sitting there makes you tired, especially when you've left and you can sort of relax. But the relaxing is just as tough as the walking in, I should imagine.
all I can say is that sitting in that cement block was dehumanizing. I mean, you know, it was absolutely dehumanizing. I felt such empathy for the people who were coming to visit, because, you know, there were some women dressed in very tight pants, clearly coming to see their lovers or whatever, and there were some gorgors, etc. In any event, we were finally called to the desk. We showed our visitor's card, and we had to stand in a line. I felt like I was in the military, and we had to. I called her eyelashes in my book. She's a buxom correctional services woman, bursting out of everything with long eyelashes, fake eyelashes. And she stamped my hand with my wrist with that, that ink that shines.
Like you're going to a club.
Exactly, like you're going to a club. And I went through the door, and it picks up on the light. And you then go through this weird corridor, and you eventually land up. I was told, because I did my research, by somebody who'd sat inside for fraud. He said, go to the tuck shop. He said, because if you put money into Kobus Geldenhuis's account, he's more likely to talk to you. So I went to the tuck shop, and it was weird because this Afrikaans music was playing, like a Steve Hofmeyr kind of song. And it was weird because all the officials, they were black women, and they were all jiving to the Steve Hofmeyr song, or this Kurt Darren song, which was one of the two. And I gave 400 Rand in cash, and she dutifully wrote it in her big book. And I went the wrong way. And a correctional services officer laughed, and he said, no, this is not the way, this is the way. And eventually we went down one long corridor after another, and they said, that's the visitor's room. And there was a man dressed, I mean, COVID was still, you know, very much at its height. There was a correctional services, rather an inmate dressed in full orange with his face completely masked up. And he was taking this spray. I thought I was actually going to cough to death because he was disinfecting everything. There was double glazing, and there were these stools, you know, that were cemented into the floor.
So
and
you can't use them as weapons.
Not exactly. And there was 50 of them, I counted, from one length of the room to the other. And I sat at the first one. And I watched another convict inside, behind the glass, holding kind of a register. And he would call people in, and they were all black, and they would go and they would talk. They would sit on the other side of the glass partition and talk to their relatives or whoever they were. And it wasn't like you see in the movies where you pick up a phone and you speak. There were these tinny microphones or tinny speakers that were on the table in front of you, and you'd need to like lean in to be heard. So it was really weird. Anyway, I must have waited, David, for It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been. But it certainly was more than 30 minutes. And my nails were biting into my wrists because I was clenching my fist because I didn't know how I'd feel. And while I was sitting there, I spoke to a gentleman next to me whose son was 18 and he raped a 15-year-old. But his father was quite perplexed because he said, we would have looked after the baby. So his son really didn't do anything wrong. And the parents of the girl who was made pregnant, they're looking after the baby and they want nothing to do with either his son behind bars or with him. And he really wanted to look after the child. So this was really sad. And then I noticed a very buxom woman flirting outrageously with a convict on the inside. You know, beating her eyelashes and really flirting with.
Can't be good for the guy behind the glass, you know. He's going to go back to a cell full of guys. This could be interesting for him.
It could be. And then I saw Quirvis, and Quirvis was completely different from the man I remembered. I remembered him being quite slight, my height, a little bit taller, with very dark hair. And hair as if somebody put a toilet seat on top of his head and literally cut his hair around, very policeman. And here I saw somebody bent over with very thinning grey hair, but the same eyes and the same beak nose. And he walked up to the window and he looked in my eyes and he had a mask on and he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Hello, Quirvis, I'm Janine." He said, "Janine from where?" I said, "From Norwood." And he nodded his head and I said, "Don't you remember when you were sentenced to death, I was smuggled down to the holding cells by a plainclothes policeman and I interviewed you?" And he looked a little bit confused and I said, "And in fact, I started to cry. And you took a piece of toilet paper or tissue paper out of wherever you were and you put your hand through the bars and you wiped my tears." And he looked perplexed. And then I said, "And a warden made you a snackwich and you broke it in half and I ate it." And then he remembered and he said, "Hello, Janine."
I want to stop you there. I mean, from everything you've told me to this point and what's in the book, to have somebody like that then dry your tears, offer to break bread, literally and figuratively with you. Yet I know that there was no empathy. And I know that given half a chance, he would have killed you had that opportunity presented itself. Yet do you think it was conscious on his part what he was doing in order to maybe soften you a little bit so that if you did start asking difficult questions, there was a moment of connectivity rather than distancing at that particular point?
You know how much flack I came in for in newsrooms? Because despite myself, I mean, I've been covering news for many, many years, and I've always covered violence. I was a crime reporter. Despite the evil that I saw every single day of my life, I've always tried to find a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of humanity. And when I interviewed him on death row, he started to cry and he said his parents hadn't even come to visit him. They were in Cape Town. They didn't think he was worth it. And God help me, I actually felt empathy for him. I found empathy for this monster. He looked so alone. He was clutching his tissues and this well-worn Bible, and he was telling me that, you know, he'd given himself over to Jesus. They all say that. I know that. I'm not a fool, but I was taken in by it. And when I told colleagues in the newsroom, they said, "How could you have even eaten with him?"
Yeah.
But, you know, he spoke to me and he said he was so sorry for what he'd done. And he'd left his grandfather's watch at one of the murder scenes, and he'd left, you know, his DNA all over, and he couldn't understand why police couldn't find him. And he wanted to be caught, and he was relieved when he was caught. So this thread of bizarre empathy that I felt, I wanted to find again. 27 years later, I wanted to find it. I was determined to find this shard of twisted light in this monstrous man.
Did he kill all the women that he raped?
He initially, well, he would survey the flats. He would I lived in a first floor corner flat in Grant Avenue, so I lived within a 2.5 kilometer area of his kill zone. And he killed women. He killed one next door to me, one behind me in a block of flats. He raped a woman in the flat on the left of my block, and he also raped and killed a woman in a commune about 1 kilometer away from me. And I looked like his victims. They were dark-haired. I had much longer dark hair, about my height and my build. And in fact, I was a Jane Fonda hip-hop aerobics instructor, and I used to teach at the Sharper Image across the road, and I knew his victims. They were in my class. I knew them by name. Right. They loved my, so I fit his profile, and it was incredibly uncomfortable to be recognized by him yet again. 27 years later, he'd actually placed me, and I didn't think he would. Oh, and he did ask me, David, he said, are you going to write a book, or are you writing a magazine article? And I said,
I've gone for a long form, fellow. You're getting a book.
Yeah. So he said, I said, well, how would you feel if I did? He said, it's your life. You must do what you like.
Now, he was a policeman. He was based at the Norwood Police Barracks, which was not too far away from where you live or live.
I realized I never answered your question, and that was about did he rape first or did he kill? So what would happen is that he would survey his victims' homes. He would get an urge. He called it the ding, the thing. Would wake up, or at about 10, 11 o'clock, this thing would grab him. He would then climb up the drain pipes of first floor corner flats, and I lived in a first floor corner flat at the corner of Grant Avenue and Ivy Road. Nobody had burglar bars, and he would climb into the window. He would find his victims in bed. He would pistol whip them and then rape them. Then he would tuck them in and tell them to slap lacquer, have a good night. And he would then he was known as a happy and a slicky. So he would bite into the cheese or bite into the polony, leaving his DNA all over the place, or have a gulp of milk or from the orange juice carton, and then make his way down the drain pipes again. But he'd always recce the places before he'd attack. But then when the women switched the lights on, or he switched the lights on, he decided that they would need to die. So because they could identify him. But I mean, I've interviewed so many criminologists over the years. That's the natural evolution, or how a serial killer evolves. They eventually start raping, and then they kill.
Because as a policeman, I mean, he obviously wasn't the brightest candle in the packet, because leaving your DNA all over the place and wanting to get caught. So my next question then is, once he was caught and you were used as bait, how did the police at Norwood treat you? I mean, were you treated with respect? Was there disdain from them, in as much as, oh, you're trying to catch one of our colleagues? We don't believe it is.
Well, I was told off the record at the time. I mean, I was a gung-ho crime reporter, and there was nothing I wouldn't have done for a story. I was told.
I know you even stood on the corner of Oxford Road with some ladies of the night.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, 26 cars stopped in 45 minutes. Let that go on the record. That's about a car every 2 minutes. So I always knew that there'd be another job for myself if I couldn't make it.
It was your pension fund, Janine.
Exactly. It was always good to know you can moonlight as something else.
Exactly. Talk about pivoting. Anyway, back to the story.
Exactly. So for this particular, the Norwood policeman, Captain John Miles, was tolerant, but I got up his nose, because I was always there in his face. What was quite interesting with him is that at the time that the killer was at his reign, right at the siege, in the epicenter of the attacks, an identikit was issued that looked nothing like the killer. In fact, he was a friend of mine. He was working as a police reservist at Norwood Police Station, pockmarked skin and short, spiky blonde hair. And Captain John Miles, head of the Criminal Investigation Division and Station Commander of Norwood, got a tip-off that a man matching this identikit was lounging around the Houghton Golf Course. So he hopped in his vehicle, put his blue lights on, and as he sped along to the Houghton Golf Course, he saw a plainclothes policeman, and he said, "Hop in the car. We've just had a positive lead on the Norwood killer." The man who hopped in the car was the Norwood killer. So they pulled my friend in for questioning, and they found out he wasn't the killer. But then the police said it was probably a cop. And how they knew it was a cop is because police, the bullets or the cartridges that were found on crime scenes came from police-issued firearms. So they knew they were looking for a cop. And for a year and a half, they didn't find anybody. And everybody in Norwood were up in arms. I mean, Tony Leon, who was then leader of what was the Democratic Party, not the DA, the Democratic Party, had this DA-covered table outside the Norwood Spa, obviously in an effort to get votes, but also calling for the police to do something and apprehend the killer. And I did interviews. I mean, I led the story for a year and a half and was on the front page every single week, which is what you want as a journalist. And people were saying to me, it's one of their own and they're protecting him. In any event, what the police did eventually is they started fingerprinting all the white single cops at the Norwood single barracks. And Kobus Geldenes, his full name is Jacobus Petrus Geldenes, he was a lance sergeant. He decided that it was time to duck town, to leave Dodge. So he decided to move back in with his parents on the East Rand. Between all of this, Brixton Murder and Robbery Squad came into the scene. And Brixton Murder and Robbery Squad were these old, hard-bitten apartheid cops. And I was a crime reporter, and they knew that I lived exactly in his kill zone. So they asked if they could use my flat as a surveillance point. And for 3 weeks, they drank all my wine, all my beer, frightened my cats under the bed, who lived there for at least 3 weeks, and kept their own bizarre hours. And I had pump-action shotguns all over my cane furniture. It was quite weird, but there was a. I've always been an adrenaline junkie, and it was really. I knew that I was the closest journalist to the story. And then one night, it's like out of a movie, they said, "Would you walk past down Grant Avenue, or rather down Iris Road?" Because they believed that he lived in the Norwood Police Barracks. And I duly did my gym class and walked down Iris Road in the middle of the night with the police sitting on the roof waiting to get him in their gun sights. Well, they didn't. So as the net, if you like, closed in and single white cops were being fingerprinted, Kobus moved back home. And the thing struck him again. And he climbed over the wall. No, it was his neighbor. He climbed over the wall to his parents' neighbor, Veronica Taylor, and he knocked on the door. And a young girl of 16 opened the door, and he said he was trying to sell her makeup. And she said she didn't want. So he went through the back door, which was open. He dragged her onto her mother's bed. He raped her and he shot her in the face. And her mother was in a key corporate position at Standard Bank, and she found her daughter's bloody body sprawled over her bed. And the cartridge had lodged itself in the mattress springs. And interestingly enough, it wasn't Brixton that got him. It was East Rand Murder and Robbery Squad.
And I'm going to have to stop you there, Janine. If people want to find out, because you're running out of time, if people want to find out any more, they now have to go and buy your book. It's one of those, you're going to almost end on a cliffhanger. But I want to sort of in closing ask you, the lessons that you learned when writing this and before as a crime reporter. I know that you teach media training and you're in the corporate world. Did you bring anything across from those early days to teach the people or to train people that you do now? Has it been incorporated into your lesson plan, so to speak?
David, I can speak to serial killers. I can speak to chief executive officers of multinational corporations. I'm not afraid to speak to anybody. And because I'm an ex-journalist, I have the ability to get people to talk to me. So I'll have a chairman of a big brand or a serial killer, they will open up to me. And that's my skill.
Great stuff. The book is called Bait to Catch a Killer. It's by Janine Lazarus, and it's published by Melinda Ferguson Books. It's a rip-roaring read. And now with December coming up, people sitting at home, if you want to be, I don't want to say scared, but if you want to read how these things play through, it's not, as you mentioned earlier, like what you see on television. The evil on TV is not the evil that you sit across from behind plexiglass in the real world. So thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for joining me on In Conversation With. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. I was going to say, I look forward to your next book, which could have been set on the corner of Oxford Road and Jan Smuts. I don't know. Maybe some of those ladies of the night are still hookering there. You can do another book on that.
Don't think so, David, but thanks for the suggestion.
My guest today on In Conversation With has been Janine Lazarus. If you're interested in how this turns out, buy the book.